Hello, everybody. And today, what we're going to focus on is the start of the Industrial Revolution. So, this will be topic 5.3 in the AP World Curriculum. So, we're going to go through a couple of different things, a little bit different than what the class lecture was about, but it's going to have a lot of overlap. So, let's start first with the overview of industrialization. First, we want to start with the basic definition of what we mean by a country that is industrialized. When a country is industrialized, or there's been an industrial revolution, there's been first a revolution in production. What's happening is that things are, or manufactured goods, are being produced through machines as opposed to human hands. So, what's happening is we've mechanized the process of producing goods for society. So, that's the first definition. The second definition is a revolution of consumption. This basic idea that an economy is based on the purchasing of things. So if you have this idea that before industrial revolution, the economy was largely driven by agrarian or agricultural interests and agricultural demands. What's happening is we're becoming more of a consumer-based economy, where the economy is driven by people purchasing manufactured goods. And in essence, that's what we've become. We are consumers of goods and services. And that consumption is what drives the economy. Think about what's happened because of the COVID-19 pandemic and the economic impact it's had on some industries. If going for vacations is a form of consumption, look what's happened with the end of that consumption or the decline of that consumption. There's been an economic ramification. So the Industrial Revolution also brings in this emphasis on consumer behavior, and that represents a significant change. And then the third significant change is the way we generate energy. And what we're seeing after the Industrial Revolution or during the Industrial Revolution is the use of fossil fuels, oil and coal, to fuel the machineries that we're using. So today, we rely on gasoline, which is derived from oil. We're relying on electricity. We're relying on fossil fuels still today. And this fossil fuel creates an energy that we've never had access to before. So the impact on the human species cannot be overstated. Basically, if you look at these parentheses, we've gone through three ways of kind of organizing ourselves. We began, and for about 93% of our existence as a species, we were hunters and gatherers. In fact, some would argue that we are built to be hunters and gatherers. We still have those instincts, we still have those reactions. The way we are engineered as human beings is to be a hunter or a gatherer or to be both. Then we went into agriculture and we became agriculturalists. And this started around 8500 BCE. And it continued up till 1800s, 1900s, probably 1900s that we really see the decline of agrarian-based societies. We have agrarianism still, we have agricultural practices, but even that has been industrialized. And then, of course, we have the industrialized society, which is where we are today. Now, some people might see this as a movement from primitive to more sophisticated or cultured ways of doing things. What I would argue is that these are just three ways for us to provide the resources we need to survive. And there are consequences, both positive and negative, each of these methodologies. And industrialization, we're going to be talking a lot about the positive and negative impacts that this development has had. So if we look real quick at some of these consequences, you'll appreciate how industrialization is truly one of the most consequential things to happen in our history. Our life expectancy across the board is going to increase because the Industrial Revolution is also tied to scientific advances that allow us to promote a more healthy lifestyle, to promote an understanding of our world so that we can survive in it longer. Second, our standard of living is going to increase. We are just simply going to be more comfortable in today's day and age than we would have been 200 years ago. And the standard of living in terms of not just the niceties of life and the comforts of life, but also the necessities of life. We're going to have more access to the necessities. Because of industrialization, we will have more access to food than we ever have in our history. Um, Inequality. So the Industrial Revolution is going to result in economic changes, and there's going to be more wealth generated because of the industrialization. The industrialization's production of more wealth is going to be distributed inequitably among society. In other words, the wealth is going to be generated is going to improve some groups, and for other groups, they're not going to share as much in the improvement. So that creates an inequality not just within societies, but also globally. Some countries are going to be much wealthier than other countries. And there's going to be a significant difference and gaps in terms of economic wealth. So that is a continually evolving situation. And while inequality has been part of history, industrialization in some ways has made it even more stark. There's also going to be competition for resources. For industrialization to work, you have to have access to resources. Resources like oil, resources like coal. You need to have access to markets. And that's going to lead to competition. And that competition is going to grow beyond what it already was, which is going to result in two of the biggest world wars we have ever seen in world history. And those world wars, World War One, World War Two, are wars that are a war of an industrialized society. And you can see how brutal and how devastating they were by virtue of industrialization. And then lastly, of course, industrialization has a huge impact on the environment, whether it be the emission of greenhouse gases and the effect that's had on our atmosphere, the effect it's had on our climate, or if it be pollution and the effects it has on our immediate environment. The consequences of the environment, or sorry, consequences of industrialization on our environment is something that we'll be taking note of between now and the end of the course. So that's your overview of industrialization. This is the most consequential development in world history. And that's just some of the reasons why. So if we go to why Europe and why it's Europe that is the first society to industrialize, this is a great study in historical interpretation. The traditional explanation for Europe industrializing first, and the traditional idea is that European culture encouraged this type of innovation. And what historians used to say was that European civilization fostered a sense of freedom, a sense of creativity that allowed for the innovations that led to industrialization. And that traditional interpretation that the European culture laid the groundwork for this industrialization has been challenged in historian studies. So the argument has been undermined considerably over the past 20 to 30 years. One way to undermine that argument is to point out that technologically, other civilizations at the time of industrialization were just as advanced as Europe, and in fact, probably more advanced. Paper making was an innovation that China had come up with. Agricultural innovations throughout the Middle East, as well as scientific advances, are well documented. The innovation of agriculture throughout the Americas, the innovation throughout African civilizations and architecture. In other words, all the civilizations that we've studied, China, the Middle East, West Africa, the Americas, all had technological innovations before Europe had theirs. So if Europe is so creative that led to this technological innovation, then you have to point to the other areas and go, well, they're creative as well. Second, the economic advantage. The idea is that at the time of the Industrial Revolution, West Europe had emerged as a player in world affairs, but it still was not the dominant economy. The dominant economy at the time was China and India. China and India were both mass producing goods. They just weren't doing it the way industrialization will do it. And then the third one is to consider how quickly industrialization spread. If Europe and Western society is so unique that only industrialization can develop there, then how does it latch on so quickly across the globe? And within the past 250 years, human beings have transformed over to an industrialized society for the most part. That is a remarkable achievement. And the fact that it's so rapidly adopted throughout the world indicates that this wasn't something that was unique to European culture. Yet, it cannot be denied that industrialization began in Europe. So, why do we think it began in Europe? What was it about Europe that made this such a perfect place for industrialization to begin? Well, one is the political nature of Europe. Simply put, there's a great deal of competition between the various states of Western Europe. And these states and their competition, that is going to encourage innovation. So if you're an empire like China, or if you're an empire like the Ottoman Empire, where you don't have that competition, there's really no incentive to grow and get better because you're not trying to beat somebody out. So the competition of the political nature of Europe would encourage innovation, particularly in military technologies. So that's one argument, is that in a way the industrialization grows because England wants to dominate the other European nations. And once England gets industrialization, the other European nations go, we have to catch up. And that creates kind of an industrialization race amongst these European nations. Second, Europe, because of the commercial revolution, had elevated the merchant class as well as the innovator class. So you have this emerging class of the middle class, the bourgeoisie, as I once referred to them as. And this class is growing in wealth, and they also have a tremendous amount of freedom to pursue their interests. Because the kings like the wealth that they can get from these merchants through taxes, the kings, by and large, allow for property rights to be protected. They allow for patent rights, in other words, the ability to control an idea, and they allow for people to keep their money that they make in businesses. And that encourages innovation and growth. And then the third thing is the global connections. Europe is going to build up a significant global presence throughout the 1700s. And in the 1800s, that global presence is going to grow even more. And what that gives Europe access to are markets to sell their goods and resources to help support their industry. So the old argument is that the European culture led to innovation. The new argument is that circumstances within Europe led to the innovation that we call industrialization. For my final slide, we're going to focus on why Britain. Why is it that Britain is the one that develops? And in class, I showed you the Heimler's history video that answered this very question, and it went through 8 major things. I'm going to focus on 5 major things as a way of reinforcing this. First, agricultural improvements. In the 1700s, Britain simply got better and more efficient at farming. They started to introduce new methods of farming, the crop rotation being one of them, new technologies such as the seed drill. And all of these things, what it accomplished was an increased yield of crops on the land. Simply put, they became better farmers. And since they were growing more food and they needed fewer people to do the farming, they're able to generate potential workers for the industrialization. So what happens is you have workers who, the small farmers, for example, who are going to the cities because the small farms are getting absorbed by larger farms. So now you have these farmers who aren't needed, who go to the cities and supply labor to these new factories and these new industries. But you also have more food, which leads to an increased population, and those people need jobs. So they go to the factories and they supply cheap, unskilled labor. The second thing is that Britain was heavily engaged in commercial activity. In other words, they were already established as a commercial economy. which will allow them to access resources they need and will allow them to connect with markets to sell their goods down the road. The third thing that the commercial activity did was it increased the wealth of the wealthy. And the wealthy of England were able to take that wealth from the commercial revolution and redirect it and invest it into industrialization. Letter C deals with the political aspects of England. One, England had put out tariff protections. So the government sets up a system to prevent outside imports or outside imports to undersell local industries. And what that does is it props up local industries. So policies of tariffs that were supported by the government. Second is the patent system. Now, the patent system is if you come up with an idea, an invention, a way of doing things, you can trademark that idea. And anybody who uses your idea has to pay you a cut. So this is known as copyright. This is known as trademarks. These ideas are kind of all covered under the patent system. And what that encourages and supports is innovation. Because if I have an idea, I want to profit off of that idea. The patent system guarantees that all those profits from that idea will be mine. So that encourages people to make risk or take risk and to make innovative ideas try to work. And then lastly, this religious toleration idea. So Britain, they had settled their problems. There was not going to be minority groups being targeted. So what that means is that Britain can harness the energy of its whole population. And the religious toleration means that Britain doesn't experience the wars that Europe will because of religion. Britain is relatively protected from civil wars and revolutions. So in the 1800s, when France is going through a revolution and that revolution is disrupting the continent, Britain is relatively protected, which means that it can engage in this economic pursuit of industrialization. Letter D deals with the support of practical science in Britain. What happens is that Britain supports the scientific revolution. They support the scientific discoveries and the scientific experimentation, and that scientific knowledge is going to be critical to the technological developments of the Industrial Revolution. Lastly, Britain as an island has a great advantage. Since Britain is an island and it has rivers all throughout Britain as well, Britain can connect itself much more easily than most other nations. And that means that resources from the whole nation can be brought together to support industry. So try it this way. Let's say there are coal deposits in the southwest region, what we call Wales, of the British Isles. There's coal deposits there. And getting those coal deposits to factories in southeast, what we call England, you can use rivers and you can also use the ocean to transport that coal in significant quantities to that factory. So what that means is I can connect the resources and the markets together much more easily because it's much easier to go on water than it is to walk on land. I also can carry more and transport more through water than I can through land. And then lastly, being an island provides stability for Britain. Britain doesn't have to worry about being invaded the way France and the German states do. And being an island means that Britain has a natural way of providing stability and protection for its society. So this industrialization takes off in Britain because they have the resources and they have a growing population of unskilled laborers looking for work. And they have wealth to invest into those industrializations. And lastly, they have the gift of stability where they are safe and secure, which allows them to engage in this innovation. So that's why the industrialization begins in Britain, in Europe, and that's your overview of industrialization. So next time we'll talk about the spread of industrialization and the developing technologies of industrialization. So until then, all the best to you. Take care.